In the summer of 1806, the United States of America was 30 years old. 30 years old and already coming apart at the seams. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry. Half the country was ungoverned wilderness. Spain lurked on the southern border with soldiers and money and patience. Native nations held the interior, and the settlers who had pushed west into Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio were asking a question that terrified the men in Washington. Why should we answer to you? The Mississippi River was everything to the western frontier. It was the highway that carried their crops to market, the artery that kept their economies alive. And the city at the mouth of that river, New Orleans, was the most strategically important piece of land on the continent. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the West. Thomas Jefferson knew this. The British knew this. The Spanish knew this. And so did one other man. A man with no army, no office, no money, and nothing left to lose. A man with a plan so audacious, so dangerous, so close to succeeding, that it would force the young republic into the most important courtroom drama in its short history and ask a question nobody had ever had to answer before. Could the United States of America survive one of its own founders trying to destroy it? This is the story of the Burr conspiracy. To understand how Aaron Burr ended up on trial for his life, you have to understand what America looked like in 1803. Thomas Jefferson had just completed the Louisiana Purchase. With the stroke of a pen and $15 million, the United States had doubled in size overnight. The new territories stretched from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains, an enormous, largely unmapped, barely governed wilderness of rivers and forests and plains. On paper, this land now belonged to the United States. In reality, it was a powder keg. Spanish troops still controlled territory on the southern and western borders. Native nations held enormous swaths of the interior. The settlers who had pushed into Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio felt distant from the Eastern government in Washington. Many of them resented the federal establishment. Some openly questioned whether the western states might be better off as a separate nation, closer to the Mississippi trade routes that were their economic lifeline, than to the distant Atlantic seaboard. Into this volatile landscape rode Aaron Burr. After the duel with Hamilton in July of 1804, Burr's political career was finished. He was under indictment for murder in both New York and New Jersey. He completed his term as vice president under a cloud so dark it blocked out everything he had ever achieved. When his term ended in March of 1805, he had no office, no income, no political future, and no plan. What he had was ambition, and ambition without an outlet is one of the most dangerous forces in human history. Burr turned west. He began making contacts, floating ideas, testing the waters with frontier leaders and military men and wealthy speculators. What exactly he was planning has been debated by historians for 2 centuries. The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain, because Burr was a man who told different people different things, and committed as little as possible to paper. To some, he spoke of a military expedition against Spanish Mexico, something that could be framed as patriotic if war broke out between the United States and Spain. To others, he hinted at something bolder, a new Western nation, independent of the United States, with New Orleans as its capital and himself as its leader. To almost everyone, he promised wealth, adventure, and a chance to be part of something historic. The island appeared in the Ohio River like something out of a novel. Blennerhassett Island sat on a secluded bend of the river near what is now Parkersburg, West Virginia. It was the private estate of Harmon Blennerhassett, an Irish immigrant of considerable wealth and considerable eccentricity. He had built a mansion on the island. He had a library, a private laboratory, a manicured garden. He was educated, idealistic, and desperately bored. When Aaronburr arrived at Blennerhassett Island in the spring of 1805, it was as if a comet had struck a very still pond. Burr was magnetic. He spoke of grand designs with the kind of confidence that makes ordinary men feel like they are standing on the edge of history. Blennerhassett was captivated. He opened his island, his resources, and eventually his fortune to the conspiracy. Boats were built, supplies were stockpiled, men were recruited quietly, carefully. Word passed from one disaffected frontiersman to the next. By the summer of 1806, Blennerhassett Island had become the staging ground for something. What exactly that something was remained deliberately vague, but the ingredients were unmistakable. Armed men, flatboats, weapons, provisions for a long journey south. The destination was the Mississippi. The ultimate target was New Orleans. Now here is the man who makes this story extraordinary, the man without whom there might have been no conspiracy at all, and without whom there might have been no trial. General James Wilkinson. Wilkinson was the commanding general of the United States Army in the Louisiana Territory. He was a hero of the Revolutionary War, a respected military figure, a man of considerable authority on the western frontier. He was also, and this detail is critical, a paid agent of the Spanish crown. For years, Wilkinson had been receiving secret payments from Spanish authorities in exchange for intelligence about American military movements and frontier plans. He operated under a Spanish code name. He was, by any definition, a traitor. He simply had not been caught yet. Wilkinson was also one of Aaronburr's key allies in the conspiracy. The two men had been corresponding for months. Wilkinson had encouraged Burr, offered his cooperation, implied that the army might look the other way, or even support the enterprise when the moment came. What Burr did not know was that Wilkinson was calculating his options the entire time. By the fall of 1806, Wilkinson decided that the conspiracy was going to fail. He could see that Burr's support was thin, that the Western populations were not rising up to join the cause, that the whole enterprise was running out of momentum before it had really begun. And Wilkinson understood something else. If the conspiracy collapsed, and he was identified as a co-conspirator, he was finished. His Spanish dealings might surface. He might face the same treason charges that were about to descend on Burr. So James Wilkinson did what James Wilkinson always did when the political winds shifted. He switched sides. In November of 1806, Wilkinson sent a letter to President Thomas Jefferson. In it, he described a vast conspiracy against the United States, led by Aaronburr, aimed at seizing New Orleans and splitting the Republic in two. He portrayed himself as a loyal officer who had uncovered a treasonous plot. He offered to testify against Burr. He provided documents, letters, and evidence. Some of that evidence he had altered. Some of it he had fabricated outright. But Jefferson did not know that yet. Jefferson was alarmed. He issued a proclamation in November of 1806, warning citizens against joining any unlawful military expedition in the Western territories. Federal authorities moved to arrest Burr's co-conspirators. Blennerhassett Island was raided by the Virginia militia. Blennerhassett himself fled into the night. Burr's flotilla, which had set off down the Mississippi with perhaps 60 men and a handful of flatboats, was a shadow of the force he had dreamed of commanding. When word reached Burr that Wilkinson had betrayed him and that federal forces were closing in, he had a choice: fight or run. He ran. Burr abandoned his men and headed east through the Mississippi Territory, trying to reach Spanish Florida and escape the country entirely. He was recognized and captured in February of 1807 by a federal agent named Nicholas Perkins, who reportedly spotted Burr's fine clothing and military bearing as incongruous with the backwoods setting where he was hiding. He was transported under armed escort to Richmond, Virginia to stand trial. The courtroom at Richmond in the summer of 1807 was unlike anything the young republic had ever seen. Chief Justice John Marshall presided over the proceedings, and that fact alone charged the atmosphere with political electricity. Marshall and Jefferson despised each other. They were cousins who had chosen opposite sides of nearly every political question in American life. Jefferson believed in a powerful popular democracy with limited federal authority. Marshall believed in a strong federal government and an independent judiciary. Their battles over the meaning of the Constitution had already produced landmark decisions, and now the president's most prominent political enemy was sitting as the judge in the president's most important prosecution. Jefferson made no secret of his belief that Burr was guilty. He communicated with prosecutors. He pressured witnesses. He made public statements about the trial before it was concluded. By modern standards, what Jefferson did would be called prosecutorial interference. By the standards of 1807, it was simply a president doing what he believed necessary to protect the republic. Marshall watched all of this with cold, careful eyes. The prosecution's case rested on a sweeping interpretation of treason. Under the Constitution, treason is defined as levying war against the United States or adhering to its enemies and giving them aid and comfort. The government's lawyers argued that Burr had assembled men and arms with the intent to seize New Orleans, that this constituted levying war, and that therefore Burr was guilty of treason, regardless of whether the actual attack had ever taken place. The key witness was James Wilkinson. The general arrived in Richmond already under suspicion. Defense lawyers had obtained evidence of his Spanish dealings. His own letters had been altered before being presented to the grand jury. Multiple witnesses testified that Wilkinson had fabricated or embellished parts of his account. When Wilkinson took the stand, he was a commanding physical presence, a big man with an impressive uniform and a soldier's bearing. But under cross-examination, the contradictions in his testimony multiplied. He stumbled over dates and details. He could not adequately explain the alterations to the key cipher letter that had been submitted as evidence. Members of the grand jury were openly skeptical. One grand juror later said that if Wilkinson had not been under the protection of the government, he would have been indicted himself. Burr's defense team, which included some of the finest legal minds in America, hammered this point relentlessly. They argued that the government's entire case rested on the testimony of a man who was himself a traitor, a liar, and a foreign agent. Without Wilkinson's evidence, there was nothing. But the more important battle was happening at the level of constitutional law. John Marshall's ruling on the meaning of treason was the pivot on which the entire case turned. Marshall issued his opinion on August 31, 1807. It was meticulous, careful, and devastating to the prosecution. Marshall held that under the Constitution, treason required an overt act, not a plan, not an intention, not a conspiracy discussed in letters and private meetings. An actual, physical, overt act of levying war, witnessed by at least two people, as the Constitution explicitly required. The government had alleged that the overt act was the assembly of men and boats at Blennerhassett Island, but Burr himself had not been present at Blennerhassett Island when the assembly took place. He was miles away at the time. Marshall ruled that a man could not be convicted of treason for an act he did not personally commit, even if he had planned it, directed it, or set it in motion from a distance. The doctrine of constructive treason, which held that being part of a conspiracy was enough to make you guilty of the conspiracy's acts, had no place in American law. The Constitution's language was specific. The proof had to be direct. The act had to be witnessed. This ruling gutted the prosecution. They could not prove that Burr had personally committed an overt act of war on American soil. And without that proof, under Marshall's reading of the Constitution, there could be no conviction. On September 1, 1807, the jury returned its verdict. Not proven. That was the exact language. Not guilty. Not proven. The crowd in Richmond erupted. Some cheered. Some booed. Jefferson was furious. He called Marshall's ruling a mockery of justice, and privately accused the Chief Justice of shielding a traitor for political reasons. Burr walked out of the courtroom a free man. But he was not vindicated. He was simply not convicted. And in the court of public opinion, the verdict was far harsher. The aftermath of the Burr trial scattered its principles across the map of history like shrapnel from an explosion. Aaronburr, acquitted but destroyed, fled to Europe. He spent years in England and France, trying to interest foreign governments in various schemes and enterprises. None of them came to anything. He eventually returned to the United States in 1812, resumed his law practice in New York, and lived out his remaining decades in relative obscurity. He died in 1836, outliving almost every other founding figure, a man of extraordinary talent who had spent his genius on ambition and paid for it with everything he had. Harmon Blennerhassett lost his island, his fortune, and his magnificent mansion to the conspiracy. After the Virginia militia raided his estate, it was looted and eventually destroyed by fire. He spent years pursuing compensation from the government and from Burr himself, collecting almost nothing. He died in poverty on the island of Guernsey in 1831, still dreaming of the fortune he had once possessed. James Wilkinson continued his career in the United States Army with a brazenness that still astonishes historians. Despite the evidence of his Spanish dealings that surfaced during the trial, despite multiple courts of inquiry into his conduct, Wilkinson was never convicted of anything. He commanded American forces at the start of the War of 1812, distinguished himself primarily through a series of military disasters, and was finally removed from command in 1813. He died in Mexico City in 1825, still chasing schemes and still, by some accounts, in contact with foreign agents. He remains one of the most corrupt figures in American military history. And John Marshall? Marshall continued as Chief Justice of the United States for another 28 years. His ruling in the Burr case was one piece of a vast constitutional architecture he spent his career constructing. The narrow definition of treason he established in 1807 remains the law of the United States to this day. It has protected civil liberties, constrained executive overreach, and forced the government to meet a high evidentiary standard before it can accuse a citizen of the most serious crime in the constitutional vocabulary. Here is what makes the Burr conspiracy more than just a story about one man's ambition. In 1807, the United States was 30 years old. The Constitution was barely 20. The Republic had never faced a serious internal challenge to its territorial integrity from one of its own political leaders. Nobody knew whether the system could hold. Jefferson believed that prosecuting Burr aggressively was the only way to signal that the Republic would defend itself against internal threats. He was willing to stretch the law, pressure witnesses, and influence proceedings to get a conviction because he believed the alternative, letting Burr walk, would embolden every ambitious man on the frontier who dreamed of carving out his own domain. Marshall believed something different. He believed that allowing the government to convict a man of treason on the basis of conspiracy and inference, without direct proof of an overt act, would create a weapon that future administrations could use against any political enemy they chose to destroy. Today, it would be Burr. Tomorrow, it could be someone whose only crime was opposing the government. Both men were right. That is what makes the case so enduring and so uncomfortable. The Republic needed to be defended, and the law that defended it could not be bent without breaking something essential. Marshall chose the law, and by choosing the law in a moment when the temptation to choose convenience was enormous, he established a principle that has outlasted every political crisis, every era of national fear, every moment when governments have been tempted to define treason broadly enough to silence their enemies. The Burr conspiracy did not tear the Republic apart. The Western territories did not rise up. New Orleans was not seized. No empire was carved from the frontier. Aaronburr's grand design collapsed before it fully formed, betrayed by a double agent, abandoned by its recruits, and dismantled by the courts. But the lessons it left behind are carved into the foundations of the American legal system. A man's plans, however sinister, are not enough to convict him. Proof must be direct. Acts must be witnessed. Accusations, even presidential accusations, must be tested by evidence. And the line between ambition and treason, however thin, must be drawn by law and not by power. Friedrich von Steuben saved the Continental Army with skills hidden beneath a fabricated rank. Aaron Burr nearly destroyed the republic he had helped create with ambition that consumed everything it touched. One man lied to build something, the other schemed to unmake it. And in the end, the thing that stopped the unmaking was not an army, not a militia, not a presidential proclamation. It was a courtroom, a judge, and a constitution that meant exactly what it said. Sometimes the most important battles in a republic's history are fought not on a battlefield, but at a defense table, in front of 12 citizens, with nothing but the law standing between ambition and catastrophe. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and drop a comment below. Do you think Burr was guilty? Do you think Marshall made the right call? The debate has been going for 200 years. It is not settled yet. And if you learned something new today, smash that like button so more people can find this channel.